Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the crowded, dust-filled markets of the ancient Roman city, where beneath the colonnaded porticos and between the stalls piled high with grain and pottery and woven cloth, another kind of transaction was taking place, one that was entirely ordinary to the Romans who witnessed it, and entirely defining for the people at its centre. We are stepping into the world of the captive, the enslaved, and the conquered woman of Rome. A world that stretched from the furthest military frontiers of the Roman Empire, from the mist-covered hills of Britannia and the river plains of Gaul and the olive groves of Hispania, all the way back to the beating heart of the city itself, where the great slave markets operated with the same commercial regularity as the grain markets and the cattle auctions that surrounded them. Tonight's exploration will take us through the full arc of how Roman military conquest created a vast and steady supply of enslaved women, how those women were processed, categorized, sold, and absorbed into the most intimate corners of Roman domestic and social life, and how the Roman legal and moral framework understood their condition in ways both clinical and revealing. We will examine the specific documented campaigns that generated the largest movements of captive women, the mechanics of the Roman slave trade at ports like Delos and Ostia, and the varied roles that enslaved women filled across Roman households of every class. We will also examine what rare accounts have survived in the Roman historical and literary record that bring us closest to the texture of individual lives within this institution. This is a quiet, careful, and deeply layered exploration of one of Rome's most pervasive and formative realities, so settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin. The practice of enslaving women captured during military conquest was not, for the ancient Romans, a matter of exception or scandal. It was, by every measure available to modern historians, an entirely normalized and legally codified feature of Roman civilization, one that operated continuously across the entire span of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, from the earliest recorded wars of the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, all the way through to the gradual dissolution of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century of the Common Era. To understand Roman society in its fullest and most honest form, it is essential to understand this institution, not as a peripheral detail, but as something woven into the fabric of Roman law, Roman economics, Roman domestic life, and Roman cultural identity at the most fundamental level. The Roman world at its height, roughly from the 2nd century BCE through the 2nd century CE, was a slave society in the most complete sense of the term. Scholars estimate that at the peak of the Roman slave economy, during the late Republic and early Empire, somewhere between 30 and 40% of the population of the Italian peninsula alone consisted of enslaved individuals, with the broader empire containing tens of millions of people living in legal bondage. Women formed a very substantial portion of this population, arriving through the well-established channels of military conquest, piracy, slave breeding within existing households, and the complex commercial networks of the Mediterranean slave trade, the networks that connected the battlefields of Gaul and the Greek East to the auction platforms of Rome itself with remarkable efficiency and regularity. Tonight, we will move carefully and without haste through 12 detailed sections that together compose a full picture of this subject. We will trace the origins of captive women in Roman military campaigns, examine the legal framework that defined their status, follow the mechanics of the slave trade that carried them from battlefield to market, and explore the many domestic and social roles they occupied across the long centuries of Roman power. Before we continue, a quiet and sincere word of gratitude to everyone watching tonight. If you are finding this a calm and thoughtful companion for rest or study, a like or a gentle share is always warmly welcomed. And subscribing to the channel helps others discover this kind of peaceful, detailed content as well. We would love to hear in the comments which historical topics you would most enjoy exploring next, and we do genuinely wonder where in the world you're watching from and what the hour is as you settle in for the evening. And now, with that warm acknowledgement offered, let us move carefully into the first section of tonight's journey, the Roman art of war and the production of captives, how military conquest created enslaved women. To understand the presence of captive women within Roman society, it is necessary first to understand the precise mechanics of Roman military conquest and the formal protocols that governed what happened to a defeated population once a Roman army had achieved its objective. The Romans did not simply fight wars and return home. They fought wars in order to expand territory, extract tribute, acquire resources, and, with great deliberateness, to acquire human beings. The capture and enslavement of the populations of conquered towns, villages, and regions was not an incidental consequence of Roman military activity. It was in many cases a primary strategic objective, and the Roman military machine was organised and supplied in ways that made the processing and transportation of large numbers of captives an entirely routine matter, no different in principle from the transportation of other forms of military plunder. When a Roman army besieged and ultimately took a fortified town or city, the standard sequence of events that followed was well established and widely documented by Roman historians. The historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century before the Common Era, described the Roman practice of permitting soldiers to plunder a captured city following its fall, and within this practice was embedded the taking of captives. The soldiers would move through the city, and the inhabitants who had not been killed in the fighting, who were overwhelmingly the women, the children, and the elderly, the very people least able to flee or to resist, would be gathered into central locations, typically the main forum or the largest open space within the city walls, and there they would be held under guard while the officers determined what was to be done with them. This process was conducted with the organisational efficiency that was characteristic of the Roman military apparatus at its best, and it left very little room for individual mercy or exception. The Roman term for this category of person was captivus, or in the plural captivi, though enslaved women were also referred to within the broader legal category of servi, meaning slaves, once they had been formally processed and their legal status as property had been established. The distinction between a captive who had just been taken and a slave who had been fully integrated into the Roman commercial and legal system was a real and meaningful one in Roman law, and understanding this distinction helps clarify what the experience of a captured woman involved at each stage of what was, for her, a profound and irreversible transformation from one kind of existence into a fundamentally different one. The scale of Roman military conquest in terms of the human populations it displaced was genuinely vast. During the Gallic Wars conducted by Gaius Julius Caesar, between the years 58 and 50 BCE, Caesar himself recorded in his own account of those campaigns, the work known as the Commentary de Bello Gallico, that during the single campaign year of 57 BCE, the Roman legions had taken prisoner approximately 53,000 inhabitants of the territory of the Aduatuci tribe alone. While Caesar did not always distinguish clearly between male and female captives in his numerical accounts, the general pattern documented across Roman military history strongly suggests that women and children constituted a very large proportion of those taken alive, since men of fighting age were more commonly killed in battle or executed afterward as a security measure, while women and children were understood to have high commercial value as enslaved persons, and were therefore treated as a resource to be preserved and exploited rather than eliminated. The campaigns in the Eastern Mediterranean produced similarly large numbers of captives. The Roman wars against the kingdoms of Macedon and the various successor states of Alexander the Great's empire during the late 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE were particularly productive in this regard. When the Roman general Lucius Aemilius Paulus defeated the Macedonian king Perseus at the Battle of Pydna on the 22nd of June in the year 168 BCE, the aftermath of that victory included the systematic plundering and depopulation of the region of Epirus, during which, according to Livy's account, approximately 150,000 people were taken captive and sold into slavery in a single campaign season. A significant portion of these were women and children from the rural settlements of the region, and their absorption into the Roman slave economy represented both a massive economic event and a demographic catastrophe for the populations from which they had been taken. What happened to these women in the immediate aftermath of capture was a process that was deliberately organised and efficiently managed. Roman military camps had designated areas for holding captives, and there were specialists within the Roman army's logistical apparatus who were responsible for cataloguing, guarding and preparing captives for eventual sale. These individuals were known as mangones, a term that referred broadly to slave dealers, and they followed the Roman legion specifically in order to purchase captives from the soldiers at low prices and then transport them toward the major slave markets of the Mediterranean world, earning a profit on the difference between the price at which they acquired captives from soldiers eager for immediate cash and the higher price they could obtain in the organised markets of the major cities. The physical experience of the first days and weeks after capture was one of profound and total rupture. A woman taken captive during the fall of a Gallic town or during the Roman pacification of a Greek city had until that moment existed within a fully formed social world, a world with its own language, its own religious practices, its own legal customs, its own kinship networks, and its own understandings of personal dignity and social standing. All of this was, within hours, entirely dissolved. The language she spoke was not understood by the soldiers who guarded her. The gods she prayed to were not the gods of Rome. The relationships that had defined her as a daughter, a wife, a mother, a neighbour, and a member of a particular community had no validity or even existence within the Roman legal and social framework into which she was now involuntarily absorbed. The Roman triumph, the formal victory parade through the streets of the city, included captive women among those who walked in chains before the triumphing general's chariot, transforming their suffering into public spectacle and civic celebration. The Roman military triumph, granted by the Senate to victorious generals who met specific numerical and territorial thresholds, paraded these captive lives through the streets from the Campus Martius to the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, making visible to the Roman crowds the human cost and human product of imperial expansion. The triumphs of Caesar in 46 BCE, lasting 4 days and celebrating victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa, included thousands of captives in their processions. The visual message of the display was entirely clear to those who watched it. These captive women were the living embodiment of Roman military supremacy, the human proof of another corner of the world brought under Roman power. Let us now turn our attention carefully to the broader legal architecture that structured the condition of enslaved women within Roman society, because without understanding this framework, it is difficult to fully appreciate the texture of the lives that followed capture and enslavement. Roman law and the legal status of enslaved women, property, person, and the limits of protection. Roman law was one of the most sophisticated and comprehensive legal systems produced by any ancient civilization, and it addressed the status and treatment of enslaved individuals with considerable detail and, at times, with an almost clinical precision that modern readers may find both illuminating and deeply troubling in equal measure. The Roman legal tradition, which developed continuously from the early Republic through the classical period of the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, and found its most comprehensive expression in the great legal compilations of the 6th century CE commissioned by the Emperor Justinian, devoted enormous attention to the category of the enslaved person, and within that category, the situation of enslaved women received particular attention because of the specific legal complications that arose from the possibility of reproduction, the question of ownership of children born to enslaved mothers, and the complex relationship between sexual access and property rights within an institution that recognized no boundary between the two. The foundational principle of Roman slave law was deceptively simple. The enslaved person was, legally speaking, a thing rather than a person. The Latin term res, meaning a thing or an object in the legal sense, was the category into which enslaved individuals fell, and this classification had profound consequences for every aspect of their lives, because they were classified as objects of property rather than as subjects of law. Enslaved women had no independent legal capacity whatsoever. They could not bring legal actions, could not testify in court in most circumstances except under torture, could not enter into marriages that were recognised by Roman law, and could not inherit property or transmit it to their children. Their existence in the eyes of Roman law was entirely mediated through the person of their owner, who held over them a right that the legal sources described as absolute within certain practical limits. The jurist Gaius, writing in the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era, in his highly influential textbook on Roman law known as the Institutiones, laid out the fundamental distinction that Roman law drew between free persons and enslaved persons with admirable clarity. He noted that the most basic division within the category of human beings was the division between those who are free and those who are enslaved, and that this division was grounded in the law of nations, the ius gentium, rather than in natural law, which the jurists acknowledged would have recognised no such distinction. This acknowledgement that slavery was a human institution rather than a natural one was philosophically significant, and it was a point that several Roman thinkers, including the Stoic philosopher Seneca the Younger, writing in the middle decades of the first century of the Common Era, would return to with considerable reflective attention in his philosophical correspondence with his friend Lucilius. Seneca made the observation, particularly in his 87th letter, that the enslaved person had the same inner nature as any free person, that beneath the external condition of bondage there was a soul fully equal in dignity to that of any senator or emperor. But Seneca was careful to note that this philosophical observation in no way challenged the legal and social institution of slavery itself. He was not advocating for abolition. He was advocating for a certain quality of personal conduct on the part of slave owners, a kind of humane consideration in the day-to-day management of enslaved individuals. This nuance tells us a great deal about the limits of Roman moral imagination on this subject, and about the immense gap that existed between the philosophical insights that the Roman intellectual tradition was capable of generating and the practical institutional arrangements of Roman society that those insights never seriously threatened. In practical legal terms, the situation of enslaved women was governed by a series of rules and precedents that addressed specific recurring situations. One of the most important concerned the status of children born to enslaved mothers. Roman law held that the child of an enslaved woman followed the status of the mother at the time of birth, regardless of who the father was. This principle, known as the rule of partus sequitur ventrum, meaning roughly that the offspring follows the womb, had enormous implications. It meant that the child of an enslaved woman and a free man, even if that man were the woman's own owner, was born into slavery and became the property of the owner of the enslaved mother. This rule created a powerful economic incentive for slave owners to encourage or permit reproduction among their enslaved women, since each child born to an enslaved mother represented a new addition to the owner's property holdings, without requiring any additional expenditure on acquisition through the slave market. The legal framework around the sexual use of enslaved women was, by any modern standard, entirely permissive from the perspective of the owner. Roman law recognised no category of sexual violation that could be committed by an owner against a person he owned. The ius utendi et abutendi, the right to use and to use up, which Roman law granted to owners over their property, extended in principle to the use of enslaved women's bodies without any legal qualification or restriction. There was no legal remedy available to an enslaved woman who was subjected to sexual violence by her owner, or, in many circumstances, by others. What limited protections existed were framed entirely in terms of the property rights of the owner. If a third party violated an enslaved woman belonging to another person, the legal action that followed was brought by the owner against the third party for damaging his property, not by the woman herself for harm done to her person. There were, however, some developments in Roman law during the imperial period that introduced modest constraints on the most extreme forms of abuse. The Emperor Hadrian, who reigned from 117 to 138 of the Common Era, is reported by the legal sources to have restricted the ability of owners to kill their enslaved persons without judicial authorization, though the enforcement of such restrictions was inconsistent and difficult to verify through the historical record. The Emperor Antoninus Pius, who reigned from 138 to 161 of the Common Era, issued a ruling that an owner who treated an enslaved person with undue cruelty could have that person sold away from them against their will, the proceeds going to the original owner, but the relationship of ownership being permanently dissolved. These were modest ameliorations within a system that remained fundamentally coercive and exploitative throughout its existence, and they did not represent any philosophically grounded challenge to the institution of slavery as such. Moving forward in our exploration of this carefully detailed subject, let us now consider the physical journey that captive women made from the moment of their capture through the slave trade to the point of sale, because this journey was itself a defining experience that shaped everything that followed. The Mediterranean slave trade, markets, routes, and the commerce of human captivity. The Roman world was threaded together by trade routes that moved goods of every conceivable kind across vast distances, and among those goods, the enslaved human being occupied a position of singular economic importance throughout the centuries of Roman power. The slave trade of the ancient Mediterranean was, in terms of its scale, its organisational complexity, and its economic significance, one of the most consequential commercial systems in the ancient world, and the women captured during Roman military campaigns were absorbed into this system at multiple points and in multiple ways, moving from battlefield to market along routes that were well established, efficiently managed, and deeply integrated into the broader Roman economy in ways that made the trade in enslaved persons as commercially ordinary as the trade in oil or grain. The island of Delos, situated in the central Aegean Sea, served for much of the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era as the single most important slave market in the Mediterranean world. Ancient sources, including the geographer Strabo, who was writing in the late 1st century BCE and early 1st century CE, reported that the slave markets of Delos were capable of processing and selling as many as 10,000 enslaved individuals in a single day, a figure that modern scholars have debated, but that nonetheless reflects the genuine perception among ancient observers that Delos operated on an almost industrial scale. The island's role as a free port, established by Rome in 166 BCE following the Roman victory over Perseus of Macedon, meant that traders from across the Mediterranean world could conduct business there with minimal restriction, and the combination of this commercial freedom with Delos's central geographical position made it the natural hub of the slave trade during the period of Roman Republican expansion. Women arriving at Delos, whether from campaigns in the Greek East, from pirate raids across the Aegean, or from the overland routes that brought captives from the Balkans and the Black Sea coast, would have encountered a market environment that was thoroughly organised around their assessment and sale as commercial commodities. The slave dealers who operated in Delos maintained permanent premises, and the physical infrastructure of the slave market included holding areas, examination rooms and public display platforms, all of which were designed to facilitate the inspection and evaluation of enslaved persons by potential buyers who might travel considerable distances to attend the market, and who expected to conduct their transactions with commercial efficiency and legal certainty. The process of displaying enslaved women for sale in Roman markets followed conventions that were widely recognised across the Mediterranean world, and that were described, with varying degrees of discomfort, by Roman writers. Enslaved individuals were typically displayed on low platforms or raised stages, and prospective buyers were permitted to examine them physically in ways that leave no ambiguity about the total negation of personal dignity that the market experience represented. The slave dealer was expected to disclose known defects or health conditions in the persons he was selling, and Roman law, specifically the provisions of the Edict of the Curule Aediles, the magistrates responsible for overseeing markets within the city of Rome, required that enslaved persons be sold with a guarantee against certain hidden defects, including serious illness and a tendency toward running away, known by the Latin term fugitivus. The legal requirement of disclosure in slave sales is one of the places where Roman commercial law most clearly reveals the strange double nature of the enslaved person within Roman thought. Simultaneously a thing to be sold according to the rules governing commercial property, and a person whose character, history and habits were relevant to the transaction in ways that a barrel of grain's character and habits were not. The price of an enslaved woman in the Roman world varied enormously, depending on a complex matrix of factors that included her age, her apparent health, her physical appearance, her known or estimated skills and abilities, and the specific needs and tastes of the buyer. Younger women in good health who were perceived as attractive commanded the highest prices, as did women who were known to possess valued skills such as literacy, numerical competence, musical ability, or expertise in textile production or medicine. The Roman legal sources and the surviving papyri from Egypt, which provide a remarkably detailed record of commercial transactions during the Roman period, suggest that the price of an enslaved woman in the early imperial period ranged from as little as 300 to 500 sesterces for an older or less healthy individual to as much as 2,000, 3,000, or even more sesterces for a young, healthy and skilled woman. These figures should be understood in the context that a Roman legionary soldier in the 1st century of the Common Era earned approximately 900 sesterces per year in base pay. So the purchase of a high-value enslaved woman represented a very substantial economic investment that required careful calculation and commercial judgment. The port city of Ostia, situated at the mouth of the Tiber River approximately 15 miles southwest of Rome, is served as the primary maritime gateway through which goods of all kinds, including enslaved persons, entered the city of Rome. Ships arriving at Ostia from the eastern Mediterranean, from the North African coast, from the ports of Hispania, and from the commercial harbours of Gaul would have carried enslaved cargo alongside grain, wine, oil, marble, papyrus, and the hundreds of other commodities that sustained the enormous consumption economy of the imperial capital. The human cargo was offloaded at Ostia, and either held in warehousing facilities there, or transported up the Tiber by barge to the city of Rome itself, where it would eventually make its way to one of the dedicated slave markets of the city, including the well-attested market near the Forum of Trajan and the area around the Temple of Castor and Pollux in the Roman Forum. The journey from a distant province to the slave markets of Rome could take many months. A woman captured in a campaign in northern Gaul in the middle of the 1st century BCE might spend weeks in a military holding camp before being transferred to a slave dealer, then travel on foot southward through Gaul in a coffle, a line of captives chained or roped together, covering perhaps 15 to 20 miles per day on good Roman road surfaces but considerably less on the rougher tracks of provincial regions. On reaching a port city on the Mediterranean coast, perhaps Narbo in southern Gaul or Massalia, she would board a ship and make the sea crossing to Ostia or to one of the other major Italian ports, and a journey that in favourable weather conditions might take 2 to 3 weeks, but that could be extended considerably by storms or adverse winds in the autumn and winter months, when Mediterranean sailing was most hazardous. By the time she reached the slave market of Rome, she might have been travelling for 4 or 5 months, and the world in which she'd been born would have receded so far into distance and past time that it might have begun to acquire the quality of something no longer fully real. Once purchased, an enslaved woman did not necessarily remain in the city or region where she was sold. Secondary sales were common throughout the Roman world, and an enslaved woman might change owners multiple times over the course of her life, moving through the Roman world in ways that were entirely determined by the commercial decisions and personal circumstances of people who held legal power over her and who might sell her for any number of reasons, including financial difficulty, a change of household needs, or simple dissatisfaction. Let us now turn our attention carefully to the specific environments into which enslaved women were received once purchased, because the variation in those environments was considerable and deserves thorough examination. Domestic life and the roles of enslaved women within Roman households. The Roman household, known in Latin as the domus, in the case of a freestanding house, or the insula in the case of the multi-storey apartment buildings that housed much of the urban population, was the primary setting in which the lives of most enslaved women in the Roman world were lived out. The Roman domestic economy was, to a degree that can be difficult fully to appreciate from a modern perspective, almost entirely dependent on enslaved labour, and within that enslaved household workforce, women played roles that range from the most basic physical labour to positions of considerable responsibility, and even, in some cases, intimacy and personal trust that created relationships of genuine complexity within the otherwise stark legal framework of enslavement. The wealthiest Roman households, those belonging to senators, equestrians, and the very richest members of the commercial class, might contain dozens or even hundreds of enslaved individuals, organised into a complex internal hierarchy, with specialised functions assigned to different individuals according to their skills, their age, their perceived temperament, and the specific needs and preferences of the household's senior members. Roman writers such as Seneca the Younger and Pliny the Younger, both of whom wrote extensively about domestic life in their letters and essays during the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, provide rich descriptions of the internal organisation of large Roman households and the many different roles that enslaved persons filled within them, and these descriptions, read carefully and with critical attention to the perspective from which they were written, offer significant historical insight. At the most basic level, enslaved women in Roman households were assigned to tasks of physical maintenance, the cleaning and upkeep of the house, the carrying of water from public fountains to the household storage vessels, the washing and care of clothing, the preparation and serving of food, and the tending of fires were all tasks that fell primarily to enslaved women in households that could afford to maintain a domestic staff. The physical demands of these tasks were considerable. Roman household clothing, including the large woolen garments known as togae worn by free male citizens, required regular cleaning and maintenance by hand. A laborious process that involved the use of chemical agents, including fermented urine, known in Latin as lotium, which served as an effective if pungent cleaning solution. The fulleries, or fulonicae, of Roman cities, where clothing was professionally cleaned, also employed enslaved women in large numbers, and the conditions in these establishments, where workers stood for hours treading cloth in vats of cleaning solution, were physically demanding and unpleasant. The care and management of children within wealthy Roman households was another role frequently assigned to enslaved women, and it was one that carried considerable social weight and personal significance. The nutrix, or wet nurse, was an enslaved or freed woman whose role was to breastfeed the children of her mistress, a practice that was extremely common among wealthy Roman women, and that was discussed by Roman medical writers including Soranus of Ephesus, who wrote extensively about gynecology and infant care during the reign of the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century of the Common Era. Soranus offered detailed guidance on the selection of an appropriate wet nurse, advising that she should be between 20 and 40 years of age, of good physical health, of calm temperament, and of Greek background if possible, reflecting the Roman cultural preference for Greek-speaking enslaved persons in roles that involved close personal contact with children, since the Greek language was considered the language of culture and education, and early exposure to it was thought to be beneficial. The relationship between a Roman child and the enslaved woman who served as their nurse could be one of considerable emotional depth and lasting significance for both parties, though the depth of that significance was expressed and experienced in very different ways from each side of the relationship. Several Roman writers, including Pliny the Younger in his letters, expressed genuine affection and gratitude toward the women who had nursed and cared for them in childhood, and there are inscriptions from the Roman world that record the affection of free individuals for their enslaved or freed woman nurses with what appears to be sincere personal warmth. This does not, of course, alter the fundamental nature of the relationship, which was grounded in legal inequality and enforced labour, but it does suggest that the emotional texture of life within Roman households was more complex and varied than a purely transactional account would suggest, and that real human bonds could form within the framework of an institution designed to deny the full humanity of one of its parties. The physical layout of the Roman house itself reflected and reinforced the social and legal hierarchies of its inhabitants in ways that were entirely deliberate and immediately legible to anyone who moved through the space. In the typical domus of a wealthy Roman household, the rooms designated for the family's private life and entertainment, including the tablinum, the formal reception room, the triclinium, the dining room where formal dinner parties were held, and the cubicula, the sleeping chambers of the family members, were decorated with expensive wall paintings, mosaic floors, and furnishings of considerable artistic and material quality. The areas assigned to enslaved household staff, by contrast, were typically undecorated, minimally furnished, and situated in the less desirable parts of the building, often near the kitchen, the storage areas, or the service entrance, receiving less light and less ventilation than the rooms occupied by the free members of the household. Another role of considerable importance within the Roman household was that of the ornatrix, the enslaved woman responsible for the personal grooming and adornment of her mistress. In wealthy households, The ornatrix was a specialist whose skills in hairdressing, cosmetic application, and personal care were valued and in some cases highly developed. The elaborate hairstyles fashionable among Roman women of the upper classes during the imperial period, including the towering arrangements of curled and pinned hair depicted in sculptural portraits of the Flavian and Antonine periods, required considerable skill and time to create and maintain, and the ornatrix who was responsible for these styles occupied a position of daily proximity to her mistress that could develop into a relationship of personal trust and even intimacy that distinguished her position from that of other members of the household's enslaved staff. The working day of an enslaved domestic woman began very early by the standards of any culture, well before the first hour of daylight as the Romans reckoned time, and extended until the needs of the household had been met in the evening. The Roman day was divided into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, but because these divisions were proportional to the actual length of the day, rather than being fixed units as in the modern system, the working hours of summer were considerably longer than those of winter. There was no concept in Roman law or social practice of a standardized working day, or any guaranteed rest period for enslaved persons, and the hours of labour were entirely at the discretion of the owner or the overseer responsible for managing the domestic staff. Food and sleeping arrangements for enslaved household women were provided at the minimum level, considered consistent with maintaining working health, and enslaved persons typically slept in whatever space was available to them, often in shared rooms with other members of the enslaved staff, on simple pallets rather than the beds used by free members of the household. It is particularly worth noting that the roles assigned to enslaved women within Roman households were not fixed or immutable. An enslaved woman might move between different functions over the course of her life, her assigned role changing as she aged, as her skills developed or declined, or as the composition and needs of the household changed around her. Let us now consider the specific and particularly significant category of enslaved women whose roles placed them at the intersection of domestic service and sexual availability, because this dimension of Roman domestic life is among the most extensively documented in the ancient sources, ancilli and the intersection of domestic service and sexual exploitation in Roman households. The Latin term ancilla, meaning a female enslaved household servant, was used in Roman legal and literary sources in ways that often carried an implicit acknowledgement of the sexual dimensions of the service provided by enslaved women within Roman domestic settings. This is one of the most documented and most extensively discussed aspects of Roman slavery in modern scholarship, and it deserves careful, measured attention, because understanding it fully is essential to understanding the lived reality of enslaved women in the Roman world, with the honesty and precision that this history demands. Roman law, as we have already noted in the preceding section, created no category of prohibited sexual activity that applied to the relationship between an owner and his enslaved woman. The owner's right to make use of his property extended to sexual use, and this was understood throughout the Roman world as a normal and legally unproblematic aspect of the ownership of enslaved women. The Roman historian Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, writing his Lives of the 12 Caesars in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, noted as a matter of biographical interest that various emperors had enslaved concubines, recording this information in the same tone of neutral biographical documentation that he used to describe their military campaigns or their building programs. This documentary register, neither condemnatory nor celebratory, is itself historically revealing, indicating the degree to which such arrangements were considered entirely unremarkable features of the domestic lives of powerful Roman men. The Roman concept of pudicitia, which might be translated as chastity or sexual virtue, was a quality that Roman culture associated exclusively with free women, and particularly with freeborn Roman citizen women of good family. Enslaved women were, by legal definition, excluded from the category of persons who could possess pudicitia, because pudicitia was a social and legal status attached to personal freedom and citizen standing, rather than to individual moral choice or conduct. This ideological framework served to remove enslaved women from the sphere of sexual ethics entirely. Their sexual availability was, within this framework, not a moral question at all, but simply a feature of their legal condition, as unremarkable and as unchallengeable as their obligation to perform any other form of labour required of them by their owner. The Roman jurist Ulpian who was one of the most influential legal thinkers of the classical period and who served as the Praetorian prefect, effectively the highest administrative official in the empire in the early 3rd century of the Common Era, addressed in his legal writings the question of what distinguished an enslaved woman kept for sexual purposes from other categories of enslaved person. His discussion, preserved in the great legal compilation known as the Digest of Justinian, reflected the entirely matter-of-fact way in which Roman law treated this category of enslaved service. There was, for Ulpian, and for the legal tradition he represented, no legal or moral problem with keeping an enslaved woman for sexual use. The only legal questions that arose concerned issues of property transfer, inheritance, and the status of any children born from such arrangements, all of which were addressed with the same technical precision that Roman law applied to other questions of property management. The philosopher Seneca, whose Stoic ethical framework led him to think more carefully about the inner lives of enslaved persons than most of his contemporaries, nonetheless accepted the institution of slavery as a social given that his philosophy could critique in its particulars, but could not challenge in its foundations. In his philosophical writings, he drew a distinction between the enslaved person's outer condition, which was legally one of complete subordination, and their inner life, which he argued was free and dignified regardless of external circumstances. But even Seneca did not make the argument that this inner freedom entitled enslaved women to refuse sexual use by their owners or by anyone else within the household. The gap between his philosophical insight and his practical recommendations is one of the most striking features of Roman moral thought on this subject, revealing how thoroughly the acceptance of slavery as an institution penetrated even the most searching intellectual traditions of the Roman world. The domestic context of sexual exploitation of enslaved women created specific human situations that the Roman literary sources, for all their limitations as historical evidence, do occasionally illuminate with unexpected clarity. The relationship between a male owner and an enslaved concubine could, over time, develop dimensions of genuine human attachment and emotional complexity that sat uneasily alongside the fundamental legal inequality on which the relationship was based. There are cases documented in the Roman sources of owners who became deeply attached to enslaved concubines, who eventually freed them through the process of manumission, and who in some cases subsequently married them, though such marriages attracted social criticism in elite circles, where the stigma of the freedwoman origin was considered a permanent stain on the dignity of a marriage alliance. The Roman elegiac poets of the Augustan period engaged with enslaved women as figures of literary and erotic interest, and their work, while shaped by the conventions of a highly artificial literary genre, nonetheless contains observations about the proximity and availability of enslaved women within the household that are historically informative. Ovid's Amoris, written around 18 BCE, contains a passage in which the poet instructs his enslaved woman attendant, addressing her directly, to facilitate his access to his free mistress. The detail with which Ovid describes the enslaved woman's position and her capacity to help or hinder his aims reveals an implicit acknowledgement of her agency and intelligence that sits uneasily alongside the broader framework of her legal non-personhood, suggesting that Roman observers were perfectly aware, at some level, of the contradiction between the legal category of the enslaved woman as a thing and the obvious reality of her personhood. What evidence we have for the inner experience of enslaved women in these situations comes primarily from indirect sources, from the gaps and silences in the literary record, from the occasional oblique reference in funerary inscriptions, and from the careful interpretive work of modern scholars who have dedicated considerable energy to reading these sources against the grain. The enslaved woman, in Roman literary sources, is almost always seen from the outside, described, categorized, and evaluated by free observers rather than speaking for herself, and this fundamental asymmetry in the historical record is itself one of the most important facts about the experience of enslaved women in the Roman world, a silence that speaks as eloquently as any text. Let us now turn our attention carefully to the institution of manumission, because the possibility of freedom, however rare and conditional it might be, was a meaningful feature of the Roman slave system that deserves careful examination. Manumission, freedom, and the path from enslaved woman to freed woman in Roman society. Manumission, the formal legal act by which a Roman owner released an enslaved person from bondage and granted them their freedom, was a feature of the Roman slave system that distinguished it in certain important respects from slave systems in other societies and in other historical periods, and it has been a subject of considerable scholarly attention and debate in the modern study of Roman history. The Romans manumitted their enslaved persons with what modern scholars have described as a relative frequency, compared to other ancient slaveholding societies, though the motivations behind individual acts of manumission were complex and varied, and did not necessarily reflect humanitarian concern for the freed individual as the primary consideration. The formal mechanisms of manumission in Roman law were several, and were graduated in terms of the legal consequences they produced. The most prestigious and legally complete form of manumission was that performed in the presence of a Roman magistrate known as Manumissio Vindicta, in which the owner formally declared before a legal official that the enslaved person was free, and the magistrate touched the person with a rod, symbolizing the transformation of their legal status from property to person. This form of manumission conferred full Roman citizenship on the freed person, along with the legal name of the former owner, following Roman naming conventions and a range of civic rights and responsibilities. A second common form was manumission by testament, in which an owner stipulated in their will that certain enslaved persons should be freed upon the owner's death, a practice that was common enough that the Emperor Augustus eventually passed legislation, the Lex Fufia Caninia of 2 BCE and the Lex Alia Sentia of 4 CE, restricting the proportion of a slave household that could be freed in any single will, reflecting concern that excessive testamentary manumission was depleting the Roman labour supply. For enslaved women specifically, manumission most commonly occurred in circumstances connected to their personal relationship with their owner, reflecting the intimate dimensions of domestic enslavement that we have already examined. The Roman legal sources and the historical record more broadly suggest that enslaved women who had served as concubines or personal companions to their owners were among the most likely candidates for eventual manumission, particularly if they had borne the owner children, if they had served the owner loyally over many years, or if the owner had developed a genuine personal attachment to them over the course of a long domestic relationship. The practice of freeing an enslaved concubine and then formally marrying her was legally permissible in Rome, though it was socially stigmatized among the upper classes, where marriage to a freed woman, known as a liberta, was considered a departure from the expected standards of senatorial or equestrian society. The condition of the freed enslaved woman, the liberta, was one of considerable legal complexity that left her in a position significantly different from that of a freeborn Roman citizen woman. While she was legally free, her relationship to her former owner, who was now referred to as her patron, the patronus, was governed by a body of legal obligations and expectations that significantly constrained her practical independence. She owed her patron formal respect and certain kinds of labour and service, as had been agreed at the time of her manumission. She was expected to refrain from actions that might harm his reputation or interests. She could not marry without his consent in certain circumstances, and her patron retained a claim on a portion of her estate if she died without children. These obligations, known collectively as the obsequium owed by a freed person to their patron, created a legal relationship that was far more binding than that which existed between a free Roman citizen and any other person, and that constituted a genuine and practical limitation on the freed woman's ability to direct her own life as she chose. The liberta occupied a specific and recognised social position within Roman society, one that was neither that of the enslaved person nor that of the freeborn citizen, and one that was subject to considerable social commentary and cultural stereotyping in Roman literary sources. Roman comedy and satire paid considerable attention to freed women, often characterising them as ambitious, calculating, and eager to climb the social ladder, a characterisation that probably tells us more about freeborn Roman anxieties about social mobility than about the actual character or conduct of freed enslaved women. The freed woman who had been manumitted by a wealthy patron, and who subsequently used her freedom, her skills, and her social connections to establish a comfortable and independent life was, from the perspective of Roman conservative opinion, a somewhat threatening figure, because her success challenged the implicit assumption that the hierarchies of Roman society were natural and immovable, rather than contingent and constructed. The children of a freed enslaved woman occupied a different and more favourable legal position from their mother, and this difference was one of the most important ways in which the institution of manumission contributed to the gradual demographic transformation of the Roman population over the centuries of imperial rule. If those children had been born after their mother's manumission, they were born free and were not subject to the legal obligations of the freedwoman condition. They carried the legal status of their freeborn father if their parents were in a legally recognised marriage, or, in the absence of a recognised father, a somewhat ambiguous but generally free status that allowed them to participate in Roman civic life without the formal constraints that marked their mother's position. Over the course of several generations, the descendants of freed enslaved women could and did move into the mainstream of Roman citizen life, and there is reason to believe that by the imperial period, a very substantial proportion of the population of the city of Rome had some ancestry from formerly enslaved persons, a demographic reality that the Roman citizen body absorbed without the kind of formal acknowledgement that would be required for historians to trace it with precision. The practice of manumission was not purely altruistic in its social functioning. It also served important economic and social control functions for the Roman slave system as a whole. The possibility of eventual manumission gave enslaved persons an incentive to behave in ways that their owners found acceptable, reducing the need for purely coercive management of the enslaved workforce. It allowed owners to reward loyalty and good service in a way that cost them relatively little in monetary terms, while generating significant goodwill and continued social connection through the patron-client relationship. And it allowed the Roman slave system to replenish itself continuously, since freed enslaved women who established households of their own often acquired enslaved persons of their own, becoming owners within the institution that had previously owned them. Let us now turn our attention carefully to one of the most particularly visible and well-documented categories of enslaved woman in the Roman world, the educated and skilled woman whose intellectual and artistic abilities made her a valued and culturally significant figure. Educated and skilled enslaved women, readers, musicians, midwives and healers in the Roman world. The Roman world placed a high value on education, intellectual accomplishment, and specialized practical skill, and this valuation extended into the sphere of enslaved labor in ways that created a category of enslaved women whose experience was in many respects distinct from that of those engaged in more physically demanding or less specialized domestic work. The educated enslaved woman, and the woman who possessed valued practical skills such as medical knowledge or musical ability, occupied a particular position within the Roman household and within Roman culture more broadly, one that combined high commercial value with a degree of social recognition and personal visibility that was unusual within the broader institution of slavery, and that left a somewhat more substantial trace in the historical record than the lives of the majority of enslaved women who performed less culturally conspicuous forms of labour. The practice of educating enslaved persons specifically in order to enhance their value and their usefulness was widespread among wealthy Roman households, and was, from the perspective of the owner, a straightforward commercial investment that could generate considerable returns. Greek-speaking enslaved individuals were particularly prized for educational and intellectual roles, reflecting the Roman cultural veneration of Greek learning and the practical importance of the Greek language as the medium of much ancient philosophy, medicine, science, and literature. A Greek-speaking enslaved woman who was literate and numerate was a highly marketable commodity, and wealthy Roman households maintained enslaved women specifically in the role of lector, the reader, whose function was to read aloud to the members of the household from literary, philosophical or historical texts during mealtimes, during periods of leisure, or during the owner's morning correspondence session. Pliny the Younger, in his letters written at the end of the 1st and beginning of the 2nd centuries of the Common Era, described the role of the lector in considerable detail, noting that at meals in his household he frequently had a reader in attendance who would recite literary texts while the diners ate, a practice that Pliny clearly found both pleasurable and morally improving. The enslaved or freed women who served in this capacity were required to be literate in Latin and often in Greek as well, to have a clear and pleasing speaking voice, to have sufficient literary knowledge to understand the texts they were reading, and to pace and inflect their reading appropriately, and to have the physical stamina to maintain the role through long meals and extended reading sessions that might last several hours. The training required to produce an accomplished lector was substantial, and represented a significant investment of time and resources by the household that undertook it. The field of ancient medicine provides another important category of skilled enslaved women in the Roman world, and one that has received increasing scholarly attention in recent decades, as historians of ancient medicine have broadened their interest beyond the elite male physicians whose texts dominate the surviving literary record. Roman medicine, particularly in the area of gynecology and obstetrics, the medical care of women's bodies and of childbirth, was to a significant degree practiced by women, including enslaved and freed women who had received training in medical knowledge, either within large household establishments that maintained their own medical staff, or through apprenticeship to established medical practitioners who found the training of enslaved assistants a useful way of building and managing their practices. Soranus of Ephesus, whose Gynecia is the most important surviving ancient text on gynecological medicine, written during the reigns of the emperors Trajan and Hadrian in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era, addressed his guidance specifically to practicing midwives and described the ideal midwife with considerable precision. She should be literate, so that she could read and understand the medical texts relevant to her work. She should be skilled in all branches of therapy relevant to childbirth and gynecological care, with a thorough understanding of both the theoretical principles and the practical techniques of her specialty. She should have a good memory, a love of work, a respectable manner and sound practical judgment. She should be free from superstition, so that she would not overlook sound medical treatment in favour of magical remedies that the medical tradition dismissed as ineffective, and she should be strong enough to carry out the physical demands of her work effectively, since assisting in difficult labours could require considerable physical effort over many hours. Many of the women who matched this description within the Roman world were enslaved women who had been trained specifically for this purpose by owners who recognised the economic value of a skilled midwife, either for use within their own household or for rental to other households in need of such services, an arrangement known in Roman commercial practice as the hiring out of enslaved skilled workers, which allowed owners to generate income from their enslaved property without parting with it permanently. The evidence of funerary inscriptions, which occasionally record the professional identities of the enslaved and freed women they commemorate, includes a modest but significant number of inscriptions identifying women as obstetrices or medicae, terms indicating medical practitioners, and some of these women are identifiable as formerly enslaved on the basis of their names and the formulaic language of their inscriptions. The musical and performative arts were another domain in which enslaved women held prominent and valued positions within Roman society, making them visible participants in one of the most important forms of Roman elite social life. The Roman dinner party, the cena or convivium, was a social institution of central importance in the lives of the Roman upper classes, a carefully staged performance of hospitality, cultural refinement and social connection that required considerable planning, expense, and logistical management. The entertainment provided at these events very commonly included musical performance by enslaved women, and the tibia, a double-piped wind instrument somewhat analogous to the oboe, and the cithara, a stringed instrument of the lyre family, were the most common instruments in these settings. Enslaved women who were accomplished performers on these instruments commanded high prices in the slave market and high regard within the households they served, and their performances were a regular feature of the social events through which Roman elite culture reproduced itself. As we delve deeper into this complex and layered subject, let us now consider the experiences of enslaved women who lived and worked not within the private households of individual Roman citizens, but within the public and commercial institutions that constituted another important dimension of Roman urban life, and that brought enslaved women into contact with a much wider range of people and social situations than the more enclosed world of the domestic household. Enslaved women in Roman commercial and public life, taverns, workshops, and the urban economy. The Roman city was a public and commercial environment of considerable complexity and density, and within the urban landscape of cities like Rome itself, Pompeii, Ostia, and the major provincial centres of the empire, enslaved women were visible and active participants in a wide range of commercial and public activities that existed alongside and were closely intertwined with the domestic sphere already examined. To understand the full range of experiences available to enslaved women within the Roman world, it is necessary to move out of the private household and into the streets, the markets, the taverns, and the workshops of the Roman city, because the urban commercial environment created conditions and experiences that were significantly different from those of domestic service. The taberna, the Roman tavern or shop, was one of the most ubiquitous features of the Roman urban landscape, and the streetscapes of Roman cities like Pompeii, where the archaeological evidence is exceptionally well preserved, reveal rows of tabernae lining the major streets, each opening directly onto the pavement through wide doorways that could be closed with wooden shutters in the evening. Enslaved women worked in these establishments in significant numbers, serving food and drink to customers, managing the counter, preparing and selling cooked food for the large proportion of the urban population that lacked facilities for cooking in their own cramped apartment rooms, and, in many cases, providing sexual services as part of the commercial offering of the establishment. The close connection between tavern service and commercial sexual activity in the Roman world was widely recognised and frequently commented upon by Roman writers, and the women who worked in taverns, whether enslaved or free, occupied a position of social stigma that the Roman legal concept of infamia formalised and reinforced. The commercial workshop, the officina, or ergastulum, was another important setting for the labour of enslaved women in the Roman urban economy. Textile production, one of the most economically significant industries in the pre-industrial world, was organised in the Roman period on a combination of household and workshop bases, with enslaved women performing spinning, weaving, dyeing, and finishing work both within domestic households and in dedicated commercial establishments owned by textile merchants and manufacturers. The physical demands of this work were considerable. Spinning wool or flax into thread was a laborious process that required constant attention and considerable manual dexterity, and the production of even a modest quantity of finished cloth represented many hours of enslaved labour at every stage of the production process. The fuller's workshop, the fullonica, which cleaned and finished woolen cloth, was another commercial establishment in which enslaved women worked, alongside male enslaved workers and occasionally free-wage labourers. The process of fullering involved trampling cloth in large vats containing a cleaning solution made from water, clay, and fermented urine. A physically demanding task performed for many hours at a time. The fulleries of Pompeii, several of which have been excavated in considerable detail, give a vivid physical impression of the working environment in these establishments, with their rows of large ceramic vats set into raised platforms and their associated equipment for pressing and stretching the finished cloth. The graffiti found on the walls of Pompeian fulleries include marks that may represent the recording of work by individual workers, providing a faint trace of the daily reality of labouring in these establishments. The most extensively documented category of commercial sexual service in the Roman world is that associated with the brothel, known in Latin as the lupanar, and the Roman world had a very large number of these establishments operating across its urban centres. The most completely documented example is the purpose-built brothel excavated at Pompeii, containing 10 individual rooms furnished with stone sleeping platforms and decorated with painted imagery above each door. The physical evidence from this establishment, combined with the graffiti inscriptions found on its walls, provides some of the most direct access available to modern historians to the daily reality of enslaved women working in commercial sexual establishments. The graffiti include references to women by names that are characteristically Greek, or that suggest origins in the Eastern Mediterranean, names including Mola, Maria, Fortunata, and others, who are scratched into the plaster walls by the people who moved through this space, and representing among the very few direct traces left in the historical record by enslaved women working in Roman commercial contexts. The economics of the Roman commercial sexual industry were, like everything else in the Roman commercial world, carefully organised and subject to state regulation and taxation. Brothel owners paid a regular tax, the vectigal, to the Roman state on the earnings of their establishments, and this tax was collected with the same bureaucratic regularity applied to any other commercial activity. The matter-of-fact nature of this fiscal relationship between the Roman state and these commercial establishments is a powerful indicator of how thoroughly the commercial sexual exploitation of enslaved women was integrated into Roman institutional life, treated as an ordinary feature of the urban economy rather than as a moral exception requiring special consideration or oversight. Women working in Roman commercial establishments of all kinds occupied a social position that was defined by both their legal status as enslaved persons and by the specific nature of their work, with certain occupations carrying a degree of social stigma that persisted even after manumission and that limited the social mobility available to former enslaved workers in these industries. The Roman legal category of infamia, meaning disreputable standing, explicitly included persons who had worked in certain commercial capacities, reflecting the Roman moral framework's complex and sometimes inconsistent negotiation between the economic necessity of these industries and the social desire to maintain clear boundaries of respectability. Let us now turn our attention carefully to the ways in which Roman writers, philosophers, and moralists engaged with the condition of enslaved women, because this intellectual dimension of the history is an important part of the complete picture. Roman writers, moralists, and the intellectual response to the condition of enslaved women. The Roman literary and intellectual tradition produced a substantial body of writing that engaged, in one way or another, with the condition of enslaved persons within Roman society, and within this body of writing, the situation of enslaved women received particular attention from a range of authors whose perspectives and motivations varied considerably, and whose works, read together, give us a multifaceted view of how educated Romans understood and justified the institution of slavery, even as they occasionally expressed discomfort with its more extreme manifestations. The Roman elegiac poets of the Augustan period, roughly the decade from 30 BCE to the death of Augustus in 14 of the Common Era, including Tibullus, Propertius, and above all Publius Ovidius Naso, known to us as Ovid, were among the most prominent literary voices of their age, and all three wrote extensively about enslaved women in ways that illuminate the attitudes of educated Roman men toward this category of person, while simultaneously obscuring the perspectives of the enslaved women themselves behind a screen of literary convention and poetic artifice. For these poets, the enslaved woman was frequently a figure of erotic interest and poetic possibility, her proximity, her beauty, and her enforced availability all serving as raw material for the conventions of Roman love poetry, a genre that was itself a highly artificial form of literary performance whose relationship to the actual experience of desire and intimacy was complex and mediated. Ovid's Amores, written in approximately 18 BCE, contains a passage in which the poet instructs his enslaved woman attendant, addressing her directly, to facilitate his access to his free mistress, and the passage is primarily comic in its register, a playful piece of erotic conspiracy between the poet-speaker and the enslaved woman who controls access to his beloved. But the detail with which Ovid describes the enslaved woman's position and her capacity to help or hinder his aims reveals an implicit acknowledgement of her agency and intelligence that sits uneasily alongside the broader framework of her legal non-personhood. Ovid was an exceptionally perceptive observer of the social world around him, and his writing, even when its primary aims are literary and erotic rather than documentary, contains more insight into the relational texture of life with enslaved women than much explicitly historical writing of the period. The Stoic philosophical tradition, as represented in the writings of Seneca the Younger, and later of the freedman philosopher Epictetus, who had himself been enslaved, and who wrote and taught in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era, offered a more sustained and in some ways more searching intellectual engagement with the condition of enslaved persons than was typical of Roman literary and philosophical writing on the subject. Epictetus was born into enslavement, probably in the city of Hierapolis in Phrygia, in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, and spent his early life as the property of a freedman named Epaphroditus, who served as a secretary to the Emperor Nero. His later writings, as recorded by his student Arrian in the Discourses, draw on this experience of enslavement to make philosophical arguments about the relationship between external conditions and inner freedom that have been among the most influential in the Western philosophical tradition, though the political implications of these arguments were, as we have already noted, carefully contained within a framework that did not challenge the institution of slavery itself. The Roman satirist Juvenal, who wrote his satires in the early decades of the 2nd century of the Common Era, took a very different approach to enslaved women in his writing, using their presence and condition as material for his characteristically bitter and exaggerated social critique of Roman upper-class life. In his 6th satire, one of the most extensive and rhetorically ambitious pieces of misogynistic writing to survive from the ancient world, Juvenal described at considerable length the ways in which wealthy Roman women allegedly mistreated their enslaved attendants, inventing pretexts for punishment and exercising a tyrannical authority over the domestic staff that Juvenal presented as evidence of the corruption of Roman womanhood. His account, while clearly exaggerated for rhetorical effect and shaped by the misogynistic conventions of the satirical genre, draws on recognizable social realities in ways that historians have found useful as evidence for the texture of daily life within Roman households, particularly for the social dynamics of the relationships between female owners and their enslaved women attendants. Pliny the Younger's letters provide a third and quite different perspective, that of a thoughtful and self-consciously humane member of the Roman upper class, reflecting on his relationships with the enslaved persons who served him. Pliny was a wealthy, well-connected, and deeply cultured member of the Roman senatorial class who managed large estates in northern Italy and a substantial household of enslaved persons, and his letters, written over the course of the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era, contain numerous references to enslaved individuals that reveal the effective dimensions of the relationship between owners and enslaved persons within the Roman context. Pliny wrote warmly of enslaved persons who had served him loyally over many years, expressed genuine grief at the illness and death of valued enslaved members of his household, and occasionally advocated for mild and humane treatment of enslaved persons, on the grounds that such treatment was both morally appropriate and practically effective in securing the cooperation and good service of the enslaved workforce. What this diverse body of literary and philosophical material reveals, when read with appropriate critical awareness, is the range of emotional and intellectual responses that the institution of enslaved women generated among the free Roman observers who wrote about it. Responses that range from cheerful and entirely unself-conscious exploitation to philosophically grounded reflection on the moral implications of slavery, with many gradations in between. What it cannot provide, however, is access to the perspectives of the enslaved women themselves, whose voices are almost entirely absent from the surviving record. It is particularly worth noting that this silence is not accidental. It reflects the structural conditions of an institution that denied enslaved persons the educational opportunities, the social authority, and the material resources needed to produce written records of their own experiences, and that therefore ensured its own ideological dominance within the historical record by the simple mechanism of excluding its most direct victims from the means of historical self-representation. Let us now turn our attention carefully to what the archaeological record can tell us about the lives of enslaved women, because material evidence can sometimes speak where textual sources are silent. Archaeological evidence and material culture. What objects, inscriptions, and spaces reveal about enslaved women's lives. The archaeological record of the Roman world is extraordinarily rich and varied, and within it there are numerous categories of evidence that, interpreted carefully and with appropriate methodological awareness, can tell us things about the lives of enslaved women that the literary sources either do not address or address only obliquely. Inscriptions, burial evidence, the physical layout of domestic spaces, and the material culture of daily life all contribute to a picture that supplements and sometimes significantly complicates the textual record. And recent decades have seen a substantial expansion of scholarly interest in using these non-literary sources to reconstruct the experiences of the least visible members of Roman society with greater precision and honesty than was previously possible. Funerary inscriptions constitute one of the most important categories of archaeological evidence for the lives of enslaved and freed women in the Roman world. The Roman practice of commemorating the dead with carved stone inscriptions, known collectively as epigraphy, resulted in the survival of hundreds of thousands of ancient Latin inscriptions, a very substantial number of which record the lives and deaths of enslaved and freed persons. The Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, the great scholarly collection of Roman inscriptions begun in the 19th century under the auspices of the Berlin Academy, and continuing to grow through ongoing archaeological discovery at sites across the former Roman world, contains tens of thousands of examples relevant to the study of Roman slavery, and the analysis of this corpus has been one of the most productive areas of Roman social history over the past several decades. Funerary inscriptions relating to enslaved and freed women range from simple recorded names and ages carved in basic lettering by someone with limited resources to more elaborate texts that include details of the deceased person's role within the household, their relationship to their owner or patron, their national or regional origin, and occasionally expressions of personal affection and loss from those who commissioned the memorial. An inscription found in Rome and dated to the late 1st or early 2nd century of the Common Era records the commemoration of a woman named Merope, identified as a serva, an enslaved woman who had served as an ornatrix in a wealthy household. The inscription was erected by a fellow enslaved member of the same household, suggesting that bonds of friendship and mutual care could exist within the enslaved community of a large Roman household, even in the absence of any formal legal recognition of such bonds, and that enslaved persons sometimes found ways to honour and remember each other that partially compensated for the social isolation and legal invisibility that their condition imposed. The city of Pompeii, whose remarkably complete state of preservation following the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era, makes it one of the most intensively studied sites in the entire Roman archaeological record, provides physical evidence of the spatial arrangements within which enslaved women lived and worked that is unavailable for most other Roman sites. Domestic buildings in Pompeii typically included areas that archaeologists have identified as the quarters of enslaved household members, generally small, poorly lit rooms with minimal furnishing located in the less desirable parts of the house, away from the main entertaining and family spaces, and often positioned near the kitchen and service areas where much of the enslaved staff's daily work was performed. The physical contrast between the elaborately decorated reception rooms and dining areas of wealthy Pompeian houses and the cramped cells assigned to their enslaved workforce is stark and immediately visible to any visitor to the site, and it communicates with great directness the spatial expression of the social hierarchies that structured Roman domestic life. The garden of the House of the Cryptoporticus in Pompeii yielded, during excavations conducted in the mid-20th century, the skeletal remains of a group of individuals who had taken refuge in the garden when the volcanic eruption began and had subsequently perished there as the ash and pumice accumulation made escape impossible. Analysis of these skeletal remains provided information about the health, diet, and physical condition of the individuals, some of whom are believed on the basis of their position within the house, and the objects found with them to have been members of the enslaved household staff. Osteoarchaeological analysis revealed evidence of significant physical labour in the bones and joints of several individuals, consistent with the demanding physical work described in the literary sources as characteristic of enslaved domestic service, including changes to the vertebral column and shoulder joints, consistent with heavy lifting and the carrying of loads over many years. The bronze and iron shackles and chains found at various sites across the Roman world are among the most viscerally immediate physical reminders of the coercive reality of Roman slavery. Examples have been found at Pompeii, in various parts of Roman Britain, including the site at Hockwold in Norfolk, where a remarkable set of slave chains was found in the 19th century, in the Rhine frontier region, in North Africa, and across other parts of the former Roman Empire. Some of these restraining devices are quite small, designed to fit around the wrists or ankles of individuals of slight build, and their presence in domestic contexts, as opposed to agricultural or mining settings, where their use might be more readily anticipated by modern observers, suggests that the physical restraint of enslaved persons was practiced within households, as well as in the more obviously coercive settings of the mines and the fields. Artistic representations of enslaved women in Roman visual culture constitute another important category of archaeological evidence. available across a wide range of media from monumental public sculpture to small-scale domestic objects. Roman wall paintings, mosaics, and sculptural reliefs frequently depicted enslaved attendants in scenes of domestic life, hunting, bathing, or entertainment, and these representations, while obviously shaped by the conventions and concerns of the free artists and patrons who commissioned them, contain details of dress, posture, activity, and physical type that add texture to our understanding of what enslaved women looked like, how they moved, and what they did in the Roman household as seen through the eyes of those who had power over them. The distinguishing visual marks of the enslaved person in Roman art are subtle and not always consistent, but short hair, simple undecorated clothing, and a posture of physical service rather than repose are among the features that most commonly mark an individual as enslaved in Roman artistic representations. Let us now turn our attention carefully to the experiences of enslaved women who lived not in the urban centres of the empire but in the vast agricultural estates of the Roman countryside, because the rural context produced a significantly different set of conditions from those already examined. Enslaved women on the Roman agricultural estate. Life on the latifundia. The great agricultural estates of the Roman world, known as latifundia, were one of the most economically significant institutions of Roman civilization and one of the most important settings within which the labour of enslaved persons, including enslaved women, was deployed on a daily basis across the centuries of Roman power. These estates, which grew dramatically in size and number during the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, as Roman military conquest flooded the Italian peninsula and the provinces with newly enslaved persons, and as wealthy Roman landowners accumulated vast territories, constituted a form of agricultural organisation that was fundamentally dependent on enslaved labour, and that persisted as a dominant feature of the Roman economy throughout the Republican and Imperial periods, transforming the landscape, the demography, and the social structure of the Italian peninsula and the major provinces in ways that had lasting consequences well beyond the fall of the Western Empire. The Roman agricultural writers who describe the management of large estates provide important evidence about the conditions and experiences of enslaved women in these settings. Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder, whose work De Agricultura, or On Agriculture, was written in the early 2nd century before the Common Era and is the oldest surviving complete prose work in Latin, addressed the management of enslaved labour on a farming estate with the directness and pragmatism that characterised his writing on all subjects. Cato recommended that the overseer of the estate, the villicus, should be an enslaved man of mature age and sound practical judgment, and he further recommended that the villicus should have an enslaved woman as his companion, the villica, who would be responsible for the management of the household side of the estate operation. The villica, as described by Cato, was responsible for maintaining the farmhouse, managing the food preparation and storage, overseeing the spinning and weaving of cloth, managing the household's enslaved women workers, and generally maintaining the domestic infrastructure of the estate in a condition that would support the agricultural work that was the estate's primary purpose. The role of the villica was, within the hierarchy of enslaved persons on a Roman agricultural estate, a position of relative privilege and responsibility that carried with it a degree of practical authority over other enslaved persons that was unusual within the institution of slavery, and that the Roman agricultural writers recognised as important to the efficient functioning of the estate. The villica managed other enslaved persons, had greater autonomy of movement and action than the field workers, and lived in closer physical proximity to the owners or their representatives, giving her access to a somewhat better material standard of life than that of the majority of the enslaved workforce. But this relative privilege should not obscure the fundamental nature of her condition, which was one of legal bondage with no guaranteed permanence, since the relationships and positions that enslaved persons occupied on Roman estates could be disrupted by the death of an owner, the sale of the estate, financial difficulties, or simple changes in the management preferences of the owners or their agents. Marcus Terentius Varro, whose Rerum Rusticarum, or On Rural Affairs, was written in the late 1st century BCE, and Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella, whose De Re Rustica was written in the mid-1st century of the Common Era, both extended and developed Cato's discussion of estate management with additional detail and somewhat greater attention to the human dimensions of managing an enslaved workforce. Columella in particular made an observation about the management of enslaved women on agricultural estates that is particularly revealing about the economic logic of the Roman slave system's relationship to the reproductive lives of enslaved women. He noted that it was common practice on well-managed estates to offer enslaved women who had borne a certain number of children, typically 3 or more, a degree of lightened labour and additional food rations as a reward for their reproductive contribution to the estate's enslaved workforce. Women who had borne 4 or more children might, he suggested, be granted their freedom entirely as a reward for this service, framing the emancipation of enslaved women explicitly as a return on their reproductive investment in the owner's property holdings. The enslaved women who worked in the fields of Roman agricultural estates occupied a much harsher physical environment than their domestic counterparts in urban households, and the evidence from the historical record suggests that the conditions of agricultural enslavement in the late Republic and early Empire were among the most severe of any form of Roman slavery. Field labour in the Mediterranean climate was exhausting and physically demanding, particularly during the critical seasons of planting and harvest, when the pace of work intensified dramatically and the hours of labour extended from before dawn to after dusk, leaving little time for rest or personal life. The evidence of skeletal remains from Roman period burial sites associated with agricultural contexts shows patterns of physical stress and injury consistent with heavy manual labour performed over many years, including evidence of joint degeneration, musculoskeletal stress injuries, and dietary deficiencies that speak to the inadequacy of the nutrition provided to field workers on even prosperous estates. The physical isolation of many agricultural estates from the urban centres of Roman life meant that enslaved women living on latifundia had less access to the kinds of social networks, informal support systems, and occasional opportunities for manumission that might be available in urban domestic settings. An enslaved woman on a large estate in the interior of Sicily or the Po Valley of northern Italy lived in a world defined primarily by the boundaries of that estate, by the rhythms of the agricultural calendar, by the physical demands of field and household labour, and by the relationships, both supportive and coercive, that existed within the enslaved community of that particular estate. The community of enslaved persons on a large agricultural estate could be substantial, sometimes numbering in the dozens or even hundreds of individuals, and within this community there developed social structures, personal bonds, and informal networks of mutual support that partially mitigated the isolation and deprivation of the enslaved condition, without in any way altering its fundamental legal and material nature. The slave revolts that punctuated the history of the Roman Republic, most famously the Third Servile War led by Spartacus between 73 and 71 BCE, drew heavily on the population of agricultural enslaved workers in Sicily and southern Italy, and the participation of enslaved women in these revolts, while less documented than that of the male gladiators and field workers who formed the core of the rebel forces, is attested in several ancient sources. The revolt of Spartacus, which at its height commanded an army estimated by ancient sources at somewhere between 70,000 and 120,000 individuals, included enslaved women among its followers, some of whom may have participated in the fighting, and others of whom formed part of the non-combatant community that travelled with the rebel forces. The crushing of this revolt by the Roman forces of Marcus Licinius Crassus in 71 BCE was followed by the mass crucifixion of approximately 6,000 enslaved prisoners along the Appian Way between Capua and Rome, a demonstration of Roman power and Roman determination to suppress any challenge to the institution of slavery that sent a message of terrible clarity to the enslaved population of Italy. Let us now turn our attention carefully to the final dimension of our exploration, which concerns the long-term historical legacy of the institution of enslaved women in Roman civilization and the ways in which modern scholarship has approached and continued to deepen our understanding of this subject. Legacy, scholarship, and historical memory. Understanding enslaved women in the Roman world. The history of enslaved women in the Roman world is one that has undergone significant scholarly transformation over the course of the 20th and early 21st centuries, as the field of ancient history has broadened its methods, its sources, and its fundamental questions to encompass perspectives and experiences that earlier generations of scholars had largely overlooked or treated only as marginal details within larger narratives centered on the political and military activities of free Roman men. This transformation in historical scholarship reflects broader changes in how historians understand their discipline and its obligations, and it has produced a body of work that is richer, more nuanced, and more intellectually honest about the full complexity of Roman civilization than the scholarship that preceded it. The foundational scholarly work on Roman slavery in the modern period was heavily influenced by economic and social history approaches that were most prominent in the mid-20th century. Moses Finley, whose 1980 book Ancient Slavery and Modern Ideology remains one of the most important single contributions to the field, argued for understanding Roman slavery as a fundamental economic institution that shaped the entire structure of ancient Mediterranean society, rather than as a peripheral feature or an unfortunate accident of historical circumstance that happened to coexist with the more admirable achievements of Roman civilization. Finley's work helped establish the framework within which subsequent scholars have approached the subject, though later researchers have critiqued his model for its relative inattention to the individual human experience of enslavement and to the specific conditions of women within the slave system, arguing that a focus on slavery as an economic abstraction can obscure the human reality that the institution represented for the millions of individuals who lived within it. The application of gender history methods to the study of Roman slavery has been one of the most productive developments in the field over the past several decades, generating scholarship that has fundamentally changed the questions historians ask about the Roman slave system and the sources they use to answer them. Scholars including Sandra Joschel, whose 1992 work Identity and Legal Status at Rome examined the evidence of inscriptions for the lives of enslaved and freed workers of both sexes, and whose 2010 book Slavery in the Roman World synthesized much of this scholarship in an accessible and theoretically sophisticated form, have demonstrated that careful and methodologically rigorous attention to both literary and non-literary sources can reveal substantial information about the experiences of enslaved women that had previously been invisible to or overlooked by mainstream ancient historical scholarship. The challenge of recovering the voices and perspectives of enslaved women themselves remains the most fundamental methodological difficulty in the field, and it is one that no amount of scholarly ingenuity can entirely overcome given the nature of the surviving evidence. The historical record was produced primarily by free, educated, and almost invariably male members of Roman society, and the enslaved women who appear in that record are almost always seen through the mediation of those authors' perspectives, assumptions, and literary conventions. The feminist historian Bernadette Bruton and others have argued for the importance of reading Roman sources against the grain, attending to the moments of resistance, subjectivity, and interior life that occasionally surface even within texts whose primary purposes are quite different from the documentation of enslaved experience, and using these moments as points of entry into a history that is otherwise very difficult to see with any clarity or precision. The evidence of funerary inscriptions, as noted in an earlier section of this exploration, has proven particularly valuable in the scholarly effort to reconstruct the social world of enslaved and freed women in the Roman world. The epigraphic Datenbank Klos Slabi, an online database that has made the full corpus of published Latin inscriptions searchable in ways that were entirely impossible before the digital era, has significantly accelerated scholarly work in this area, allowing researchers to identify patterns in naming, regional distribution, professional identity, and social relationships among enslaved and freed persons that would have been extremely difficult to discern from a reading of individual inscriptions in isolation. Digital humanities approaches to the Roman epigraphic record continue to generate new insights into the demographics and social structures of the enslaved population of the Roman world, including the distribution and experience of enslaved women across different regions, periods, and social contexts. The physical and bioarchaeological evidence from Roman sites continues to be refined and expanded through ongoing excavation and analysis, and the development of new scientific techniques has significantly enhanced the information that can be extracted from skeletal remains and other material evidence. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains which can reveal information about an individual's diet and geographic origins by examining the chemical composition of their bones and teeth, has in recent years been applied to Roman period burial sites, with results that are highly informative about the movement of populations within the Roman world, including the movement of enslaved persons from their places of origin to the locations where they ultimately died and were buried. Studies of skeletal remains from Roman Britain, for example, have identified individuals of North African and Middle Eastern origin who were living in Roman Britain and who are believed, on the basis of their burial context and other evidence, to have been among the enslaved persons transported to the northwestern frontier province through the channels of the Roman slave trade. Ancient DNA analysis, a rapidly developing field that has transformed many areas of prehistoric and ancient historical research since the development of reliable techniques for extracting and sequencing ancient genetic material in the early 21st century, is beginning to be applied to Roman period skeletal populations in ways that may eventually provide more detailed information about the origins and movements of enslaved persons than any other source. While this research is still at an early stage for the Roman period specifically, its potential to illuminate questions that have been unanswerable through conventional historical methods is considerable, and the coming decades are likely to see significant advances in our understanding of the demographic history of Roman slavery, including the history of the enslaved women who formed such a large and central part of the institution. What this accumulating and ever-expanding body of evidence makes clear, above all, is that the institution of enslaved women in the Roman world was not a single, uniform experience, but a vast and varied range of individual lives, each shaped by the specific circumstances of capture, sale, assignment, owner relationship, skill, geography, health, and the particular texture of daily life in their specific situation. The woman who arrived in Rome as a captive from a campaign in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd century before the Common Era, the woman who was born into slavery on an agricultural estate in Sicily and had never known any other condition, the Greek-educated reader who served in a senator's household, the woman who worked in a Pompeian tavern, and the villica who managed a farming estate in the Po Valley were all, in the most fundamental legal sense, in the same condition of absolute bondage. But the texture of their daily lives, the relationships they formed, the degree of physical comfort or hardship they experienced, the opportunities they had for human connection and personal expression, and the prospects they faced for the future differed enormously from one situation to another. This complexity is itself an important historical finding, and it is one that the best current scholarship works hard to preserve and to honour, resisting the temptation to reduce the history of enslaved women in the Roman world to a single narrative of either unrelieved suffering or of unexpected agency and resilience, and seeking instead to hold in view the full range of human experience that this history contains. As we have observed throughout this evening's exploration, the history of the Roman world is not simply the history of senators and emperors and generals and the military campaigns through which they extended Roman power. It is also, and perhaps most profoundly, the history of the millions of women who arrived in that world as captives, who lived their lives within it as enslaved persons, and who nevertheless, through their labour, their relationships, their children, and occasionally their own recorded words, left traces of their existence that we can still find and read and learn from today, across the immense distance of time that separates us from the world in which they lived. If you have found tonight's exploration of the lives of women captured and enslaved in the Roman world to be a thoughtful and restful companion for this hour, a quiet like or a gentle share is always sincerely appreciated and does help more people discover this kind of calm, detailed historical content. For those who find value in this approach to history, a soft subscription to the channel means you will be among the first to receive each new exploration as it arrives. We are genuinely glad to hear in the comments which historical topics you would most like us to examine next, whether that might be the lives of women in medieval Europe, the social world of Viking Scandinavia, or another dimension of Roman civilization entirely. You might also find value in our earlier exploration of daily life in the city of Rome, which covers the physical and social world of the ancient city in similar depth, and at a similarly careful and unhurried pace. Tonight, we have moved carefully and without haste through 12 interconnected dimensions of a history that is both distant in time and deeply revealing about the nature of human civilization and its capacity to organise itself around profound injustice in ways that were entirely invisible to most of those who benefited from it. We began by examining how Roman military conquest generated a steady and enormous supply of captive women, tracing the specific campaigns and documented practices through which women moved from free communities into legal bondage. We then examined the Roman legal framework that defined their status with clinical precision, followed the mechanics of the Mediterranean slave trade that carried them from battlefield to market, and explored in careful detail the domestic, commercial, and rural settings within which their lives were subsequently lived out over the long span of Roman history. The history of enslaved women in the Roman world is a history that resists simple summary, because the scale of the institution was so vast, the variations within it so numerous, and the human experiences it contained so complex and so varied. What we can say with confidence, on the basis of the literary, legal, archaeological, and inscriptional evidence examined this evening, is that these women were not peripheral to Roman civilization, they were central to it. Their labour sustained Roman households of every level of wealth, their skills enriched Roman cultural and intellectual life, and their presence shaped the social and demographic composition of the Roman world in ways that left lasting marks on the populations of Europe and the Mediterranean basin that persist, invisibly, to the present day. We are deeply grateful to everyone who has accompanied us on this evening's journey through so layered and carefully documented a subject. There is something quietly important about sitting with this history, about allowing these lives, so often invisible in the conventional narratives of ancient Rome, to become a little more present and a little more real. Across the distance of 2,000 years and more, the traces of these women remain, in stone inscriptions, in legal texts, in the bones recovered from ancient burial grounds, and in the words of the poets and historians who wrote about them. However imperfectly and however much through the lens of their own assumptions and limitations, they were here, they mattered, and they deserve to be remembered. Good night, and sleep well.